It was New Year's Eve for us yesterday evening, and so I wish you all a very happy new year. I hope 2020 will be a very successful year for you all, and that you'll get a lot of happiness and joy from it. Now, today I'm going to continue with what we were doing at the end of the last presentation. That was that the death process, once it's over, there are a whole set of phenomena which occur. Deathbed coincidences was one, and other things, and the other things I'm going to talk about. Let me just remind you, if I may, very quickly of where we are. Premonitions start the process in a few people. Otherwise, you're given the diagnosis by your doctor that you're going to die. And then it depends how you respond to it. If you know you're going to die, do you welcome it? Probably not. Are you afraid? Yes, possibly. Don't be. It doesn't help being afraid, because the whole process is in an interesting way looked after. The deathbed visitors will guide you. Those occur about 2 weeks before you actually die, will guide you into the next reality. We have many accounts of that, which is full of love, light and compassion. And this reality that they guide you into, the dying people get the feeling that this is in preparation for what's going to happen. Now, we then went on to discuss the actual dying process itself. We used Monica Rentz's scheme of pre-transition, transition and post-transition as our model. Remember that as in a pre-transition, before you come right up to the actual final stages of death, you have to give up everything. Give up, give up, give up. And that means that if you have a child who you love dearly and you're going to miss them, then there's no need to. What you say is, thank you so much for the lovely life that we've had together. Enjoyed it very much. And I hope that the rest of your life will be as joyful for you as the bit you've had with me before. Or if you have a quarrel with a relative, then you must solve it and say to the relative, okay, let bygones be bygones. That's it, you know. There are lots of good bits to our relationship. Always emphasize the positive, not the negative. And try and clear yourself of that, because if you don't, then going into the dying process can be quite difficult, as this will keep surfacing within your mental processes and pulling you back rather than letting you move forward. You will remember that those who had a near-death experience had no suffering at all, or 80 to 90% didn't. So it's very good protection for suffering. And prayer and meditation are also two good mental states to have before you go into the dying process. But there's another one which I recommend to you, and that is being curious. And what is being curious? Being curious is the mental attitude that you're looking for what is coming, and you wonder what it's going to be like, curious about it, want to know. Whereas it's difficult to hold fear as well as curiosity looking forward. Try it. Imagine now you're dying and that you're curious, and see what that feels like, and imagine that you're dying and are frightened, and can you hold curiosity and fear at the same time? Probably not. And we discussed that the experiences of the near-death experiences were important for a sort of model of what the process looks as if it's like. Okay, so let's go on to the talk for this evening. The first bit is we're going to talk about light at the time of death, and then we're going to talk about animal occurrences, mainly birds, cats, 1 or 2 dogs, that sort of thing that happens. Let me talk about light. This, you'll remember, is your course book, and it has a lot of experiences on light. It's The Art of Dying by myself and my wife, and on page 151, it's the start of a chapter on visions of light and mist, and I would recommend that you read that. Here's the first one. I've seen a beautiful light, and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful, I really had to fight to come back. And what does that remind you of? The near-death experience? Yeah, absolutely. Another one. She saw a light in the distance. She's being drawn towards it, but she said adamantly, I'm not ready yet. And we have 1 or 2 accounts of that. People who know that they're going to go into the light, but they're not ready, usually because they're waiting for another relative to come along. Here's another one. Suddenly he began seeing the most fantastic colours, more beautiful than he'd ever experienced before. He found himself floating, and the colours changed to a blinding, bright, white, fluffy light. All his pain was gone, and then the clouds parted and hands were beckoning to him. He went forward. He wanted to go forward with all of his might, not give a thought to me or our children. He just wanted to go towards the light. Then, in his words, some bastard kicked me in the back and I was back in my bed, and he was so angry. In other words, it wasn't quite his time yet to die completely. Another one, towards the end of his life, Mike would often drift off to sleep and come back to say that he'd seen a strong light, but it was not his time to go yet. You see, there are lots of them. Here's another one. Suddenly there's the most brilliant light shining from my husband's chest, and as this light lifted upwards, there was the most beautiful music and singing voices. What does that remind you of? Near-death experience, of course. My own chest seemed filled with infinite joy, and my heart felt as if it was lifting to join this light and music. Suddenly there was a hand on my shoulder, and the nurse said, I'm sorry, love, he's just gone. I lost sight of the light and music, and I felt so bereft at being left behind. So there are many of these. Now, most of those are light experiences when that's what the dying have experienced, but there are numbers of accounts of light in the room. Got a lovely one from a chaplain who often saw a light. It was like a candle light. Definitely wasn't artificial light or hospice light. It was just there beside the patient, and as the patient came up to death, it remained until when he took his last breath, it went out. So they're those sort of ones. So if we look at the light experiences, there are the transformation by light that people see. There's the experience of light, which is very like that in the near-death experience, brilliant, loving, helpful, supportive, that the dying themselves see. And these 2 components of it, what the patient sees and what occurs in the room, seem to be part of the dying process. Will everybody see it? No. There are very few things that happen to everybody. So many people see it, is what we can say. I haven't seen anybody do a proper, thorough audit of life experiences by actually asking the dying right up to the time of death whether they see light or not. The one that's got closest to that is that of Monica Rentz, which I was talking about in our last discussion. So, does light mean anything? Yes, it's throughout our culture. There's some wonderful books on light and what it means in our culture. Much of it relates to transcendent or spiritual light, and that usually goes with heightened consciousness. And many religions have noted the relationship between light and, in fact, an expansion of consciousness. And what did I say happened before death? Yes, an expansion of consciousness. Now, you don't only get light experiences, you get experiences with animals as well. I think I've told you the story of Oscar the cat, but for those of you who didn't hear it, it came in the New England Journal of Medicine, and Oscar was noted by the staff to get on and sit on the beds of those people who were about to die. So they started believing what Oscar was doing and noted that if he was on somebody's bed, then that was probably the next person who's going to die in the hospice. So it looks as if Oscar had a way of telling when somebody was going to die. Now, I thought this was an interesting story, and I was on British television on a show called Richard and Judy, and one of the things I said was I wondered if there were any hospice people out there who had seen behaviour of cats in their hospices and told them the story of Oscar. And 2 hospices then emailed me with accounts of a cat in their hospice who did exactly the same thing as Oscar. So if any of you know cat stories, well, let's have them on the comment page. Now, there are a number of other stories. Bird stories are a very common one, and I do wish that people would do a simple experiment. Birds are said to come as to be part of the dying experience and to be seen more often on the windowsills of those who are dying. Well, why doesn't somebody put up a video camera? Leave it on for 24, 48 hours, count the number of birds that come and visit, and compare that to when there's somebody in the room who's not dying. So it's not difficult to do. At any rate, I'm now going to hand you over to my wife, who will mention the dying stories to you. I'm terribly sorry. We'll mention the stories of birds in people who are dying to you, or people who have died, and then we can talk about other things towards the end.
This is a story which was told to us by a friend who had an uncle in Japan whom he'd seen very rarely, but who he was very, very close to. One evening, Alan and his wife were sitting in their sitting room back in the UK when his dog, who was lying beside his wife's chair on the opposite side of the room to Alan, sat up and started to behave very oddly. She began to growl, something she's never done. She seemed to be growling at Alan, or at least something in his direction. After a few moments she stopped growling, but went on staring fixedly, not at Alan, but apparently somewhere just to one side of him, as if there was somebody sitting or standing next to where he was seated. But of course there was no one there at all. After a minute or two, the dog settled down, but Alan and his wife were very puzzled still. Next day, Alan's mother phoned to tell him that his uncle had died the previous evening, just around the time the dog had begun to behave so strangely. I've also been told some interesting stories concerning bird behaviour, birds which behave in a most extraordinary way and unexpected way. This one was told was by somebody whose father had been ill and was actually dying in a small hospital. And while he was in hospital, they saw outside his window 3 big black crows, which continually walked around, even when he was moved to another room. They were walking around outside his window. And then when he arrived home, after his death, his son told him that something very odd had happened. He didn't realise it had any significance at all to his grandfather's death. He said that during the last 2 days a huge black crow had appeared in the back garden, sitting on the railing outside, and that our Abyssinian cat, who is a warrior breed and attacks anything in his territory, came indoors and wouldn't go outside. And he said that all the neighbourhood cats did the same. He said the crow just sat there for 2 days, and although he thought it was funny, it was quite unnerving as well. And then in the morning, hours after my father's death, the crow tried to come into the house through the cat flap. And you must admit that's very extraordinary bird behaviour. And this was another one told us by somebody who told us my mum kept a jackdaw when she was a child, and it's a bird she would always notice. We'd never had them at our house until the day my granddad died, and one turned up, walked up the garden and into the kitchen, straight past the cat, which took no notice at all. My cat loved my granddad and spent all the time he visited sitting on his lap. The jackdaw just looked at my mum, squawked, and then left. It's all a bit odd and not something you can easily discuss with people, as they think you're mad. And that's all the bird stories I have.
Well, there you are, some nice bird stories from my wife. Now, one of the main things that one hears in after-death experiences is clocks stopping. And this is usually in people who have a close relationship with their clock. I mean, we don't have it now nearly so much because time is available in other people's clocks on the radio, television and so on, and now particularly on our phones. So we don't have the same relationship to the clock that people used to have. Now, there's a pub in Piercebridge in Yorkshire, and that has in it a famous clock, and many of you may know the story of my grandfather's clock went tick-tock, tick-tock and stopped dead the day that he died, never to go again. Well, this story comes from an American songwriter who visited the pub and composed a song about the clock, which stopped dead the day that its owner died. In fact, it went slow when the owner's brother died, and then when the owner died, it stopped dead, never to go again. So if you're interested, go and see the pub in Piercebridge. Now, we have a number of clock stories. One of them is about Uncle Arthur, who died, and Uncle Arthur's wife went around to see his nephew, and when she went into the house, the nephew said, "I know why you've come, because the clock stopped," and he gave the time. I can't remember what the exact one was, let's say 10 to 2. And the clocks were flashing 10 to 2, or the electric clocks were flashing 10 to 2 in his house, so there was a relationship between it. But I think there has to be a clear relationship between the person and the clock, or the person and in this case the nephew and the clock. So there have to be a linking up for that to happen. The other thing that occurs is shapes seen leaving the body. I first heard about this on a golf course, or rather it occurred on a golf course, when a GP was looking at the man in front of him, or the golfer in front of him, who fell down dead with a heart attack. He rushed over to see whether he could help or not, and in the process he saw this shape leaving from the man's body. Another one of a person in Canada whose friend was crushed by a tree which he was cutting, and this resulted in again the person's death, and he too saw shapes. So shapes coming out of the body are occasional, but they do occur. Another one are mists arising from the body at the time of death, sometimes described as a mirage, sometimes described as smoke, very much like the Tibetan way of describing the phases of death. So death is a very interesting occurrence, and I think it's because of the changing consciousness of the individual as they come up to the time of death, which we've discussed. They become non-dual or cosmic. Now, I don't think all people do it to the same degree, and that's why I think the phenomena don't occur to everybody. Some people get messages and linking up at the time of their relatives or friends' death, but otherwise it doesn't seem to be absolutely universal. So one has to accept then that there are special factors which lead to these occurrences. So that then is the end of this section, and we've more or less gone through the whole of the dying process, from premonitions, deathbed visions, to moving to another reality, to the process of pre-transition, transition, and post-transition, and then finally to the actual death itself and the things the happenings which may occur after death. But my main message for you is the following: please do not be afraid of death. You don't have to. Those who've had near-death experience never are, or only very seldom. And those who are able to hold a curiosity towards the actual dying process have a much easier passage than those who don't. But the main thing I beseech of all of you is to learn about it before it happens, because that will make your transition very much easier. And once you know there's nothing to be afraid of, you can be curious as all the new sections, segments of the dying process occur to you. So thanks very much. Again, a Happy New Year as we look towards a wonderful 2020. Thank you.